That's the second time this week. Try it one more time, and it'll be the last thing you ever do.
The tray hit the floor before anyone even said her name. Crystals shattered across the marble. Coffee bled into the grout in a dark, spreading line. And the woman standing behind the mess didn't move, didn't cry, didn't apologize. She just stood there, waiting to see how bad this was going to get. "That's the second time this week," Victoria Ashworth said, without even looking up from her phone. Nobody in that room said what they'd all just seen. Because Victoria had knocked the tray herself. And in this house, that wasn't the strange part. The strange part was what happened 4 days later, when the new maid finally stopped pretending she hadn't noticed. If this story is touching your heart, don't just watch. Be part of our storytelling family. Before we dive deeper, take a moment to hit like and subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Now, let's continue. Naomi Carter had been in the house 11 minutes when she heard the first thing shatter. She was still in the staff hallway, suitcase in hand, when the housekeeper, a tired-looking woman named Mrs. Patterson, grabbed her arm and steered her the other way. "Don't look that direction," she said quietly. "Why not?" "Because in this house, looking is how people get noticed, and getting noticed is how people get fired." Naomi filed that away. She'd taken this job for one reason, and it wasn't ambition. Her mother's dialysis center had called twice that week about an outstanding balance, and the letter sitting on Naomi's kitchen counter back home used the word collections in a way that made her stomach drop every time she looked at it. Her younger brother, 17 and 1 semester from graduating, needed someone steady covering rent while he finished. She didn't have room in her life for pride. She had room for a paycheck, and this house paid nearly triple what she'd been making at her last position. She told herself she could handle anything for a paycheck like that. She had no idea yet how much that paycheck was going to cost her. 6 months earlier, Naomi had been sitting in a hospital hallway in Charlotte at 2 in the morning, listening to a nephrologist explain, in the gentle voice doctors use when they're about to say something that will reorganize your entire life, that her mother's kidneys were failing faster than anyone had expected. Dialysis 3 times a week. A specialist 2 hours away. A stack of paperwork that used words like deductible and out-of-network, the way other paperwork used words like congratulations. Naomi had been working as a bookkeeper for a small furniture wholesaler at the time. Good at her job. Steady. Unremarkable in the way steady things often are. It paid enough to get by. It did not pay enough to keep a dying woman's treatment schedule intact and put her younger brother Malik through his last year of high school without both of them drowning in the process. She'd found the Ashworth Manor listing through a staffing agency that specialized in private household placements, the kind of work people didn't talk about at dinner parties, the kind that paid nearly triple what a bookkeeping job did, precisely because almost nobody with other options wanted it. Naomi had other options once. She didn't anymore, not really. The night before she left for the manor, Malik had sat across from her at their kitchen table, doing homework he wasn't really doing, watching her pack instead. "You don't have to do this," he said. "I know. Mom would say the same thing. Mom doesn't get a vote on this one." Naomi had zipped the suitcase closed and looked at him. 17, trying so hard to look like he wasn't scared, failing at it the way 17-year-olds always do. "I need you to keep doing what you're doing. Grades, the application to state, all of it. That's your job right now. Let me worry about the rest." He hadn't argued after that. He'd just hugged her, longer than either of them usually allowed themselves, and neither of them had said out loud what they were both thinking, that whatever this job turned out to be, it wasn't optional anymore. Mrs. Patterson walked her through the wing reserved for staff, narrow halls, low ceilings, a stairwell that never seemed to connect to the same floor twice, and gave her the rules in a flat, practiced voice, like she'd said them so many times they'd stopped meaning anything to her. "You address Mr. Ashworth as sir. You address Miss Ashworth as ma'am. You never speak first. You never make eye contact longer than a second. And whatever you hear," she paused at the top of the stairs, "you didn't hear it. That's a lot of rules for a housekeeping job." Mrs. Patterson looked at her for a long moment. "It's not a housekeeping job." "Not really. It just looks like one from the outside." Naomi didn't understand what that meant yet. She would, by the end of the week. By day 3, Naomi had learned the shape of the house the way you learn the edges of a bruise, carefully, and only because you have to. Victoria Ashworth, 28 years old, only daughter of Trillionaire Gerald Ashworth, ran the household staff the way some people run a punishment: a folded napkin on the wrong side, a door left open 2 inches too wide, a greeting that came half a second too late. None of it mattered. All of it was an excuse. The staff had a name for her moods, though nobody used it where she could hear. The weather. Some mornings the weather was fine, and Victoria moved through the house barely noticing anyone in it. Other mornings, the weather turned without warning, and everyone within reach of her voice braced for whatever came next. Naomi watched a maid named Renee get accused of stealing a bracelet that turned up 3 days later in a coat pocket Victoria herself had wiped clean of dust that morning. Victoria didn't apologize. She just said, "Well, it's found now, isn't it?" and walked away, as if Renee's humiliation in front of the whole staff had simply been a rounding error. Renee wasn't fired that day. She was fired 2 weeks later, over something even smaller. A wine glass set on the wrong side of a dinner plate. Naomi noticed the pattern before anyone said it out loud. Victoria never fired people for the things she accused them of. She fired them once they started asking questions. That same week, Naomi learned about Denise. Denise had worked at Ashworth Manor for almost 2 years, longer than most of the current staff combined, before she was let go for what Mrs. Patterson only described as a disagreement over scheduling. Nobody would say more than that. But Naomi noticed that Denise's name still came up in the kitchen in a lowered voice, the way people talk about someone they miss and are afraid to be caught missing. She used to keep the household books balanced. One of the kitchen staff, a young man named Jonah, told her one evening, half by accident, half because he seemed to want someone new to know. Before she left, she kept asking about a set of invoices that didn't match. Small stuff. Then 2 weeks later she was gone. Gone how? Jonah looked toward the hallway before answering. Gone like Renee's about to be gone. Everyone saw it coming. Nobody said anything. Naomi didn't say anything either. Not yet. That night, on her one permitted call home, Malik picked up on the second ring. "How is it?" he asked. Naomi looked at the low ceiling of her staff quarters room, at the narrow bed and the small window that faced a service alley instead of the gardens she'd glimpsed from the main house. "It's a job," she said, which wasn't a lie exactly. It just wasn't the whole truth. "Mom's asking about you. Tell her I'm fine. Tell her the room's nice." Another half-truth. The room was clean, at least. "How was the chemistry test?" "I got a 91. Malik." I know. "I'm not celebrating till the semester's over." He paused, and she could hear him deciding whether to ask the next question. "You sound tired." "I am tired. It's a big house, lots of stairs." She didn't tell him about the tray, or Renee's face through the gap in the study door, or the ink stain she couldn't stop thinking about. There was no version of that story that wouldn't make him worry, and worry was the one thing she couldn't afford him spending energy on right now, not with finals coming. "You'd tell me if something was wrong, right?" Naomi looked at the ceiling a moment longer before answering. "Of course I would." She hung up feeling the particular guilt of a small, necessary lie, and told herself it wasn't really a lie yet. Nothing had happened to her. Not directly, not yet. At 10:30 that same night, Naomi was carrying fresh towels upstairs when she heard shouting from Gerald Ashworth's private study. "You think I don't know what you're doing in there?" Victoria's voice, sharp enough to carry through the heavy door. Naomi slowed outside the gap where the door hadn't fully latched. Inside, she could see Renee standing near the desk, arms wrapped around herself. "I didn't take anything," Renee said. "It was on the desk this morning. I cleaned that room this morning. I never touched anything but the surfaces. You expect me to believe that?" Naomi watched Renee's eyes fill, and for a moment their gazes met through the gap in the door. There was something in Renee's expression that stopped Naomi cold. It wasn't guilt. It was fear, but not fear of losing a job. Fear of something bigger than that, something she didn't have words for and wasn't allowed to say out loud. Naomi stepped inside without meaning to. "Ma'am." Victoria turned, irritation flickering across her face. "What?" "Mrs. Patterson asked me to bring these upstairs. I didn't mean to interrupt." "You're interrupting." "I apologize." Naomi turned to leave. Then Victoria's voice stopped her. "Renee, you're finished here." Renee's face went white. "Please, security will see you out." Naomi looked at Renee, then at the small gold watch sitting untouched on the desk, the supposed reason for the accusation. And something didn't add up. Renee had been accused of stealing something she'd allegedly had unsupervised access to that morning, and yet the watch was sitting in plain sight on Victoria's own desk, not missing at all. And there, on the underside of the watch's band, was a faint smear of dark blue ink. Naomi had seen that exact shade on Victoria's own hand not 20 minutes earlier, at dinner. She said nothing. Not yet. Renee was walked out within the hour. That evening, Mrs. Patterson found Naomi folding sheets in the linen room, moving slower than the task required, her mind clearly somewhere else. You saw what happened to Renee. I did. You should forget it. Naomi looked up. Did she steal the watch? Mrs. Patterson's expression closed like a door. That isn't the question you should be asking. It's the only one I care about. Mrs. Patterson sat down across from her, and for the first time since Naomi had arrived, she looked less like a woman enforcing rules and more like a woman exhausted from watching them get broken. Renee wasn't the first, she said, voice dropping. She was the ninth. Ninth? 9 people let go from this house in less than 14 months, some of them fired outright, some of them just encouraged to leave quietly. Denise was the 7th. Naomi's stomach tightened. Why? Mrs. Patterson glanced toward the hallway, the way people do when they're deciding whether a wall might be listening. Because every time someone gets close to something they weren't supposed to see, Victoria finds a reason to make them disappear. What are they seeing? Mrs. Patterson stood abruptly, as if she'd already said more than she meant to. I said forget it. She left the room without another word. Naomi didn't forget it. She couldn't have, even if she'd wanted to. The call from the hospital came the next morning, before her shift started. Her mother's dialysis center needed a payment within 10 days, or they'd have to adjust her treatment schedule. A polite way of saying they'd start reducing the care Naomi's mother actually needed until the account was current. Naomi sat on the edge of her narrow staff quarters bed, phone against her ear, doing math she already knew wouldn't work out in 10 days on a maid's wage, even a well-paid one. She thought about walking away from Ashworth Manor that morning. She thought about it seriously, for the first time since she'd arrived, not because of Victoria's cruelty, but because some quiet, practical part of her understood that a house this good at making people disappear quietly wasn't a house that rewarded people who asked questions. Then she thought about Renee's face through the gap in that door, and about Denise's name spoken like a warning in the kitchen, and about the exact shade of ink she'd seen twice in one day where it had no business being twice. She didn't walk away, she went to work. The following evening, Naomi was assigned to clean Victoria's private study, a rare assignment, since Victoria usually kept that room locked to staff except for scheduled cleanings twice a month. The room was immaculate in the particular way that only rooms belonging to controlling people ever are. Books arranged by height rather than subject, a desk with nothing on it that hadn't been placed there on purpose, curtains drawn even in daylight. As she dusted the built-in shelving along the far wall, Naomi noticed one section sat half an inch proud of the panel beside it, barely enough to catch the light differently. She almost let it go. She'd learned over the last week exactly how dangerous curiosity could be in this house. She touched it anyway. The panel gave way on a hidden hinge, revealing a shallow recess behind the shelf. Inside sat a small metal lockbox, already unlatched. Whether by accident or carelessness, she couldn't tell. She should have closed it and walked away. Instead, she opened it. Bank statements, 3 separate flash drives, and a stack of receipts, all under a name she didn't recognize. Ashworth Property Holdings, LLC. She'd spent 4 years doing accounts receivable before her mother's diagnosis pulled her back into service work, and she recognized the pattern in the numbers almost immediately. Payments to former household employees, each one followed within days by a transfer out to an account with no name attached. Not severance, not salary. Something structured to look exactly like both. Then she found the entry that made her breath catch. A payment dated 3 days before Renee was fired. Description field reading simply, confidential settlement, household. Naomi photographed 3 pages with a hand that wouldn't quite stay steady, replaced everything precisely where she'd found it, and had barely stepped back from the shelf when the door opened behind her. You're still in here. Victoria stood in the doorway, watching her with the particular stillness of someone deciding how angry to be. Finishing the shelves, ma'am? Victoria's gaze moved toward the bookshelf. For one long second, Naomi was certain she knew. Then Victoria's attention slid past it entirely, and something in her posture shifted. Not suspicion. Something closer to exhaustion, the kind that lives under a person's shoulders for so long it becomes part of how they stand. You knew Renee, Victoria said. It wasn't a question. Briefly. Did she tell you why she really left? Naomi kept her voice even. She said she didn't take anything. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had dropped, stripped of its usual edge. She didn't. She found something she wasn't supposed to find. A pause, longer than the first. The same thing you're not supposed to find. Naomi's pulse spiked. Ma'am? But Victoria had already turned toward the window, arms folded, and when she spoke again, it wasn't really to Naomi at all. Do you know what it's like growing up being told that the only thing anyone in this world actually respects is fear? That kindness gets read as weakness the second someone smells money on you? She laughed, short and humorless. My father taught me that before I was 10 years old. I used to think he was wrong. Do you still think that? Victoria didn't answer, and before she could, every light in the East Wing went out at once. To understand what happened next, it helps to understand where Victoria's weather came from. Victoria Ashworth had been 11 years old when her mother died, not suddenly, not in a way anyone could point to and call an accident, but slowly, over 18 months, in a wing of the manor that had since been converted into a guest suite nobody stayed in anymore. Gerald Ashworth had been building the second half of his fortune during those 18 months, closing what would become the largest acquisition of his career 3 weeks after the funeral, because, as he told a young and uncomprehending Victoria at the time, the world doesn't stop being the world just because we're sad. She'd absorbed that lesson the way children absorb the lessons that hurt them most, completely, and without ever being told to. By 13, Victoria had learned that tears in front of staff got treated as a management problem to be solved, rather than a feeling to be met. By 16, she'd learned that the fastest way to stop feeling like the frightened, motherless girl in the East Wing was to make sure everyone around her was more afraid of her than she was of anything. By 22, when she took her first real position inside her father's company, she'd learned that a woman in her position who showed warmth got called soft in board meetings where she wasn't in the room to defend herself, and a woman who showed nothing at all got left alone. Thomas Whitfield had been there through most of it, present at the funeral, present at her first day in the executive offices, present in 100 small, unremarkable moments that added up, over 11 years, into something that looked exactly like trust and functioned exactly like a blind spot. He'd brought her flowers the week her mother died and never mentioned it again, which, to a grieving 11-year-old, had felt like the only kindness in the house that didn't come with strings attached. It hadn't occurred to Victoria, in all the years since, that the absence of strings might simply mean the string was somewhere she couldn't see it yet. None of this excused what she'd done to Renee or Denise, or the 7 women before them whose names the household staff still said quietly in the kitchen. Naomi would come to understand that later, and understand it clearly. A wound explains a person's cruelty. It does not forgive it. But it does, sometimes, explain why the person doing the wounding is the last one to recognize they're doing it at all. The alarm started 30 seconds later, a low mechanical wail rolling through the dark corridors. By the time Naomi reached the main hall, a security guard lay near the base of the staircase, conscious but dazed, blood matting one side of his hair. A flash drive sat on the marble a few feet from his outstretched hand, the same model Naomi had seen inside that lockbox less than an hour earlier. Beside it, on a torn sheet of paper, 6 words in block capitals, "Ask your father who's really running this." Victoria stared at the note like it had been written in a language she almost recognized. For the first time since Naomi had arrived, the woman who ran this house through fear looked like she was the one who was frightened. "Stay behind me," Victoria said. Naomi almost laughed despite everything. "You spent a week trying to get rid of me. Now you want to protect me?" Victoria didn't answer. She didn't need to. Whatever was happening in this house had stopped being about napkins and folded towels the moment that guard hit the floor. The house's head of security, a broad, quiet man named Frank Delgado, arrived within minutes, radio in hand, expression unreadable in the emergency lighting. He crouched beside the injured guard, checked his pulse, and then, Naomi noticed it only because she was watching everyone that closely by then, glanced at the note on the floor a half-second too long before anyone else in the room had finished reading it. She filed that away too. Gerald Ashworth was waiting in his office when they reached it, his face the color of old paper. "The company's been bleeding money for months," he said, before either of them could ask. "Not big theft, small transactions, reimbursements, household expenses, severance packages nobody approved. Individually, none of it looks like anything. Together, it's tens of millions." "And the maids?" Naomi asked. "Collateral," Gerald said, and the words seemed to cost him something to say out loud. "Every one of them who noticed the pattern got accused of something small enough to make them leave quietly, and angry enough that no one would believe them if they talked." Victoria's hands were shaking. "I fired them. I did that. You gave someone the perfect cover," Naomi said. "Not cruelly. Just true. Every time you humiliated someone over nothing, it made the real reason they left look like nothing too." Victoria didn't argue. For the first time since Naomi had met her, She didn't have a comeback ready at all. Gerald's phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen, and whatever color remained in his face drained further. Delgado wants to move the household staff to the West Wing for the night. Says it's a security precaution. Naomi felt something tighten in her chest. Does that sound right to you? Gerald hesitated. That hesitation told her everything. For the next 2 days, suspicion in the house settled on Frank Delgado, and it settled fast. The detectives investigating the break-in found that Delgado had disabled 2 motion sensors in the East Wing the week before the blackout, logged as routine maintenance, but never scheduled through the normal work order system. His personal financial records, pulled after Gerald authorized a full staff audit, showed a mortgage payment 8 months behind, then suddenly current, right around the time Renee was let go. It's him, Victoria said, pacing the length of Gerald's office. It has to be him. Naomi wasn't so sure. Something about it fit too neatly. A man with obvious financial motive, a documented access failure, a paper trail practically laid out for someone to find. She'd spent enough time around real fraud, back in her accounts receivable days, to know that the people who actually did the damage rarely left a trail that clean. Real guilt was messy, this was tidy. He had access, Gerald said. He had motive. He had exactly enough of both to be convenient, Naomi said quietly. Nobody in the room wanted to hear that, including her. It was easier, for Gerald, for Victoria, for the whole household holding its breath, to believe the villain had already been found and could be removed cleanly, without anyone else in that house having to look at their own choices. Naomi understood the appeal. She just didn't believe it. Delgado was suspended pending investigation. He didn't fight it, didn't protest, just packed a small bag from his office and left the property without a word to anyone, which, to everyone but Naomi, looked exactly like guilt. To Naomi, it looked like a man who'd already figured out he was being used as someone else's exit door. Detective Alvarez, the lead investigator assigned to the case, interviewed the household staff one at a time in a small sitting room off the main hall that had clearly been chosen because it was the least intimidating room in a house built almost entirely to intimidate. She was patient in a way Naomi hadn't expected, the kind of patient that came from having heard 100 families insist the wrong person was guilty because the truth was harder to live with. Walk me through what you found, Alvarez said, when it was Naomi's turn, notebook open but pen still. Naomi described the lockbox, the statements, the settlement payment dated before Renee's firing. She didn't mention how she'd found it exactly. Some details felt like they belonged to Renee and Denise more than to a case file, but she gave Alvarez everything else. And you're confident about that date? 3 days before Ms. Reyes' termination? I photographed it. I can show you. Alvarez studied the photo for a long moment, then flipped back through her own notes. Delgado's employment start date is 8 months ago. This payment is 14 months old. She looked up. You understand what that means. It means whoever built this didn't start with him. It means whoever built this has been building it for over a year, by someone with access nobody thought to question, because questioning them would have felt absurd. Alvarez closed her notebook. You know who fits that description in this house better than I do. You've been here 2 weeks. I've been here 2 days. Naomi didn't answer right away. She was thinking about a name she'd only half let herself consider until that exact moment. A man polite enough to be forgettable, present at every important moment in this family's life for over a decade, trusted with everything precisely because he'd never given anyone a single reason not to trust him. I think I might, she finally said. That night, unable to sleep, Naomi went back to the photographs on her phone, the bank statements, the transfers, the settlement payment dated 3 days before Renee's firing. She laid them out mentally against everything she'd learned about Delgado. The dates didn't align. Delgado had been out of the country, visiting his sister in Arizona, during the week the earliest settlement payment had gone out. She'd overheard Jonah mention it in the kitchen days earlier, an offhand detail nobody had thought to connect to anything. Whoever had built this pattern had been inside the house, inside the finances, and inside the household staffing decisions for well over a year. Delgado had only been head of security for 8 months. Someone else had been here longer, someone with access to everything, the accounts, the staff, the household systems, and Victoria's own signature. Naomi thought about the operations director she'd seen twice in passing, always polite, always unremarkable in exactly the way that made people forget he was in the room at all. Thomas Whitfield, 11 years with the family, the man who'd brought Victoria flowers, staff gossip said, the week her mother died. She didn't have proof yet, but for the first time since she'd arrived at Ashworth Manor, she knew exactly where to look. The next morning, Naomi asked Jonah a question she already suspected the answer to. Who handles the household reimbursements? Not day-to-day, the actual sign-off. Jonah didn't hesitate. Mr. Whitfield, has for years. Delgado doesn't touch the money side, just security. Does Whitfield have access to the security system logs? Jonah frowned. I mean, technically, sure. He oversees pretty much every department that isn't kitchen or house. That was the answer Naomi needed. She found Gerald in his office an hour later and laid it out as carefully as she could. The timeline that didn't fit Delgado, the settlement payment predating his tenure, the access that pointed towards someone who'd been inside this house's finances and its security system for far longer than 8 months. Gerald listened in silence, jaw tightening with every sentence. When she finished, he didn't argue. He looked instead like a man confirming something he'd been avoiding for a long time. Thomas registered a dormant subsidiary under the Ashworth name last year, he said quietly. I signed off on it without reading past the summary page. I trusted him enough not to look. Victoria, who'd been standing by the window through the whole conversation, turned around slowly. He brought me flowers when my mother died, she said, almost to herself. I've known him my entire life. That's exactly why it worked, Naomi said gently. Nobody watches the person they trust completely. That's not a flaw in you. That's just how trust works. The detectives moved fast once Gerald authorized full access to Whitfield's records. Thomas Whitfield's office was found empty within the hour. His phone off, his car gone, security footage showing him leaving through a service entrance 40 minutes before anyone thought to look for him. He hadn't set out, the investigation would later reveal, to steal a fortune outright. He'd set out to make it look like Victoria was reckless enough to lose one, reckless enough that the board would have no choice but to remove her from any future leadership role, clearing a path for the person Gerald trusted most to run the company in her place. Every fired maid, every accusation, every ugly scene in a dining room or hallway hadn't been caused by Thomas. He'd simply understood something about Victoria long before Victoria understood it about herself. That a woman who ruled through fear would always be surrounded by people too frightened to notice what was actually happening around her. He'd weaponized a decade of quiet observation, and Victoria, without ever realizing it, had built him the perfect cover. Thomas Whitfield was arrested 6 hours later, outside a private airfield, less than an hour from a flight with no return ticket. What the forensic accountants recovered from his devices over the following days painted a picture more calculated than anyone in the house had let themselves imagine. Messages sent from a spoofed version of Victoria's executive account, timed to arrive on the household staffing manager's phone exactly when a maid had started asking pointed questions. Pay her and make sure she leaves quietly. If she pushes back, make it about her performance, not the money. Each message written in a clipped, businesslike tone close enough to Victoria's real voice that nobody reading it had ever thought to question whether she'd actually sent it. Alongside the messages, investigators found a private ledger, kept separately from the manipulated company books, tracking 11 years of small, careful decisions, which employees to promote into positions with just enough access to be useful, which board members to cultivate slowly, which family tensions to quietly widen rather than heal. Thomas hadn't stumbled into this. He'd built it the way a person builds a house, one unremarkable choice at a time, until the whole structure was standing before anyone thought to ask who'd laid the foundation. Gerald read through the ledger alone in his office the night after the arrest, and when Naomi found him there well past midnight, he looked less like a trillionaire than like a man auditing his own life and not liking most of the entries. 11 years, he said, without looking up. I let a man plan the slow ruin of my daughter for 11 years, and the only reason any of it stopped is because a maid I never personally hired refused to look away from a bookshelf that sat half an inch out of place. You didn't let anything happen, sir. You trusted someone who spent over a decade making sure he was worth trusting. That's not the same thing as negligence. Gerald finally looked up at her. Isn't it, though? Somewhere along the way, he closed the ledger. I think I owe you more than a job offer, Ms. Carter. The job offer's more than enough, Naomi said, and she meant it. Thomas Whitfield's arraignment took place on a gray Thursday morning, 3 weeks after his arrest, in a courtroom too small and too ordinary for the size of what he'd nearly gotten away with. Naomi hadn't planned to attend. Gerald had asked her to, quietly the night before, not as an employee, but, he'd said, as the one person in this whole affair who'd actually put the pieces together while everyone else was too close to see them. Thomas looked smaller in the courtroom than he had in the Manor's hallways, stripped of the easy, forgettable charm that had let him move through 11 years of other people's trust without ever raising a single alarm. When the judge read the charges, wire fraud, embezzlement, conspiracy, his expression didn't change at all, and Naomi understood, watching him, that whatever this man had felt while building his slow, careful plan, it hadn't been guilt, it had been patience. Victoria sat 2 rows ahead of Naomi, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. When Thomas was let out after the hearing, he looked back once, briefly, toward the family he'd spent over a decade quietly working to dismantle. Victoria met his eyes without flinching, and Naomi realized that whatever fear this man had once represented to her, it had already stopped living inside her by the time she walked into that courtroom. Outside on the courthouse steps, Victoria stood beside her father in front of a small cluster of reporters and said only one sentence beyond the prepared statement her lawyers had drafted for her. The people who kept this family running deserved better than what happened to them, and it took someone with far less power than any of us in this family to prove that to me. It made the evening news. It made Naomi, watching the clip later from the staff quarters that no longer felt quite as small as they had 3 weeks earlier, feel something she hadn't expected to feel about any of it. Not vindication exactly, something closer to relief. 2 weeks after the arraignment, Naomi took her first full weekend off since arriving at Ashworth Manor and drove the 4 hours home to Charlotte. Her mother was sitting up in bed when Naomi walked in, color better than it had been in months, the dialysis center's most recent numbers taped to the refrigerator like a report card. They said the balance cleared, her mother said, before Naomi had even set down her bag. All of it. I called to ask about a payment plan and the woman on the phone said there wasn't a balance to make a plan for. I told you I'd handle it. You didn't tell me you'd handle it like this. Her mother studied her for a long moment, the way mothers do when they're deciding whether to ask the question underneath the question. What happened up there, Naomi? Naomi sat on the edge of the bed and, for the first time since she'd left for Ashworth Manor, told her mother the whole story. The tray, Renee, the lockbox behind the bookshelf, the blackout, the courtroom that morning weeks ago. Her mother listened without interrupting, the way she'd always listened to Naomi's stories as a child, and when Naomi finished, she reached over and took her daughter's hand. You could have just kept your head down, her mother said. Taken the paycheck. Let it be somebody else's problem. I know. Why didn't you? Naomi thought about Renee's face through the gap in that study door, and Denise's name spoken quietly in a kitchen like a warning nobody wanted to say out loud. Because somebody has to be the person who doesn't look away, she said. I got tired of hoping it would be someone else. Malik came home from his after-school shift an hour later, saw his sisters sitting on their mother's bed, and dropped his backpack in the doorway to hug her, before either of them said a word. He'd gotten his acceptance letter to state 2 days earlier. Naomi hadn't told him yet that the signing bonus from her new compliance position meant his tuition gap was already covered in full. She decided, watching him laugh with their mother across the small kitchen table that night, that some good news was better delivered slowly, over dinner, rather than all at once, the way most good things in her life had never once arrived. The staff meeting happened on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after the arrest. Gerald called it himself. Renee was there. Denise came back for it too, along with 2 other former maids Naomi hadn't met, each reinstated with back pay and a formal apology none of them had asked for but all of them deserved. Delgado, reinstated as head of security, with a formal statement clearing his name, stood near the back of the room, arms crossed, watching quietly. Victoria stood at the front, and for once, nobody in that house lowered their eyes when she started to speak. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I didn't know what I was doing, she said. I knew. I liked how it felt, having people afraid to question me. I told myself it was strength. She looked at Renee, then at Denise. It wasn't. It was cruelty wearing a nice dress, and I let a man I trusted use that cruelty to nearly destroy everything my family built. Renee didn't say it was fine. It wasn't fine. But she nodded, once, and something in the room's shoulders eased at that small gesture. After the meeting, Victoria found each of the reinstated women individually rather than letting one group apology stand in for all of it. With Denise, she sat for nearly an hour in the kitchen going through the exact invoices Denise had originally flagged, admitting out loud, in detail, how completely right Denise had been from the very beginning. With Renee, she didn't try to explain herself at all. She simply asked what Renee needed to feel safe coming back, and then made sure the household actually provided it, rather than promising and forgetting the way powerful people often do once the cameras and the detectives are gone. News of the arrest reached the press within days. Thomas Whitfield's name and photograph across financial outlets, a story about attempted corporate sabotage inside one of the country's most private fortunes. Gerald issued a short statement, acknowledging the fraud and the harm done to former employees, before any reporter could spin it into something smaller. Victoria, against the advice of the family's communications team, insisted on adding a line of her own, that the households of powerful families too often protect the powerful at the expense of the people who keep those households running, and that Ashworth Manor intended to be the exception going forward, starting immediately, not eventually. It cost the family some short-term embarrassment in the business press, Victoria said, when Naomi asked her about it weeks later, that it was the first decision she'd made in years that had nothing to do with how afraid it made other people feel, and everything to do with whether she could live with herself. Victoria stepped down from overseeing household staff entirely. An independent complaint line was established, reporting directly to the board rather than to her, and Naomi, who'd spent 4 years doing accounts before hospital bills put her back in a uniform, was offered a position in the company's newly formed internal compliance office, with a signing bonus large enough to clear her mother's entire outstanding balance in a single afternoon. She almost said no. She didn't want a job that felt like charity. "It's not charity," Gerald told her. "You noticed what a dozen people with finance degrees walked past for over a year. That's not a favor. That's a job you've earned." 6 months later, Naomi passed Victoria in the east hallway, the same hallway where a security guard had once been found unconscious beside a flash drive with a message meant to tear the whole household apart. Victoria was carrying a box of donated coats for a staff family whose apartment had flooded that winter. She hadn't asked anyone to notice her doing it. "You're still here," Victoria said. "I am. I used to think being feared was the same thing as being respected." Victoria shifted the box in her arms. "It's not even close. It took nearly losing everything my father built to understand the difference. Naomi didn't say I told you so. She didn't need to. Some lessons only take root once a person has survived long enough to feel the difference for themselves. And Victoria, for the first time since Naomi had walked through that front door 11 minutes into a job she'd taken out of desperation, looked like someone who finally had. Naomi kept walking. She had a compliance report due by Friday, a mother whose treatment was fully paid through the year, and a life that no longer depended on anyone's permission to speak the truth out loud. Some people spend a fortune trying to buy silence. It took one woman refusing to give it to them to show an entire household what respect was actually supposed to look like all along. Malik graduated the following June, and Naomi sat in the third row of a packed high school gymnasium in Charlotte, her mother beside her in a wheelchair the dialysis center had finally cleared her to travel with, both of them crying in the unembarrassed way families cry at things they once weren't sure they'd live to see. A small, plain envelope arrived at the house 2 days later. No note inside, just a modest contribution to Malik's first semester expenses at State, and a card signed simply, Victoria. Naomi called to ask why. "Because you never once asked me for anything, the entire time you worked in that house," Victoria said. "Not a raise, not a favor, not even an easier assignment when you clearly deserved one. I've spent my whole life around people who wanted something from my family. It didn't occur to me until you were gone how strange it was to meet someone who didn't. I didn't do any of it for a reward." "I know," Victoria said. "That's exactly why I wanted to give you one anyway." Naomi kept the card. She didn't need the money by then. Her compliance salary and the signing bonus had already reshaped what her family's finances looked like, more than she'd ever let herself imagine, while folding sheets in that narrow staff quarters room. But she kept the card because it marked something rarer than money ever could. A woman who'd once measured her own worth by how much fear she could produce, learning instead to measure it by what she was willing to give away without being asked. Ashworth Manor was quieter now, in the way houses get quiet when the people inside them have finally stopped bracing for the next bad morning. The maids no longer lowered their voices when Victoria walked into a room. Delgado, fully reinstated, ran security with the same careful attention he always had, no longer treated as a convenient answer to a question nobody had actually finished asking. And somewhere in a low-security federal facility 2 states away, Thomas Whitfield had 11 years of quiet, patient cruelty ahead of him to think about, in a cell with nobody left to fool. Naomi thought about that sometimes, how close the whole household had come to letting a tidy, convenient story stand in for the truth, simply because the truth was harder to find and easier to ignore. She thought about Renee's face through a half-open study door, and Denise's name spoken like a caution in a kitchen, and the exact shade of ink on a watch that didn't belong where it had been placed. She thought most of all about the moment she'd almost closed that lockbox and walked away without opening it. The moment where an entire family's future and the dignity of every woman who'd worked in that house before her had rested on whether one tired, frightened, desperately underpaid maid decided to look 1 inch further than she was supposed to. She'd looked. That was the whole story in the end. Not power, not money, just one person, in a house built to make everyone else too afraid to look, who looked anyway. So let me ask you this. If you were standing in Naomi's shoes that night, staring at a locked box that wasn't yours to open, in a house that had already taught you exactly what happens to people who ask too many questions, would you have closed it and walked away? Or would you have looked anyway, no matter what it cost you? Sit with that question for a moment and drop your answer in the comments. We read every single one, and we'd love to hear which part of tonight's story hit you the hardest. Let us know if this particular story managed to keep you with us for the entire runtime. You're in the right place. Subscribe to the channel, like and turn on the notification bell for more powerful stories filled with shocking twists, family drama, family betrayals, hidden secrets, and unforgettable endings. Thanks for watching. Until the next unforgettable story, love you all.